Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to this first seminar and also webinar on tribal business. So it's our great pleasure to have Margot Hill to be our speaker for today's seminar. And her seminar title is How to Do Business with Tribes. Margot is a Spokane tribe citizen and grew up on the Spokane Indian Reservation. She serves as Associate Director of the Northwestern TTAP Center, is the co-organizer of this seminar for today. She's also Associate Director for University Transportation Center on Small Urban, Rural, and Tribal Center on Mobility. Dr. Hill served as the Spokane tribal attorney for 10 years and as a Coeur d'Alene tribal court judge. She earned her Juris Doctor from Gonzaga University of Law and her Master of Urban and Regional Planning from Eastern Washington University. She's a Husky. She also got her bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Washington. She's currently an associate professor at Eastern Washington University, where she teaches federal Indian law, planning law, and legislation, American Indian health and community administrative law, community development, and the tribal governance. Dr. Hill has more than 30 years of experience working with tribal government, enterprises, and programs. Now let's welcome Dr. Hill to start our seminar today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.
Heo putisin kasihu putisin kweli putisilichalacht Louis Quest Zipani Margot Hill Sunyapinson. Hello, everybody. Good day. I'm thankful to be here at University of Washington on indigenous lands. I know that the University of Washington has worked hard to build the Weslabub, the intellectual house. I appreciate Casey Weinkoop. My children graduated from University of Washington and worked here in the intellectual house. Craig Hill 2 years ago and Patty last year, she graduated. So I'm pleased to be sharing here at the University of Washington. I am happy to talk about tribal sovereignty, tribal engagement. As academics or state agencies, it's often that we want to go out and work in Indian country and partner with tribes. And so my point today is to talk to you about tribal sovereignty. I've been in federal court working on water adjudication issues. I've been at the table when we've negotiated gaming compacts. I was was mentioned, I was the attorney for our tribe for 10 years and then also got a master's in urban and regional planning, and so I do lots of tribal planning projects. I'm a Spokane tribal citizen. I grew up on the Spokane Indian Reservation, and I engage with my tribe and other tribes on a weekly basis. I'm often up on one of the tribal Indian reservations, and so I do a lot of work with tribal communities. So we think, why do we want to do business with tribes? Often universities or transportation officials, we will increasingly be involved with projects with tribal governments. We have businesses, tribes have businesses off reservation lands. So lots of transportation projects, roundabouts, highways, on-ramps. Tribal governments are often the largest employer in their county or region. Tribal governments are sovereign nations, and state law typically does not apply to tribes, and so it's really good for you to understand a little bit about federal Indian law and policy. A lot of the history and the things that I'm going to talk about are not taught in high school civics. You just don't understand the legal relationship or the federal trust responsibility of the United States government or how states should interact with tribes. So we're going to talk about a lot of these things, and that it's really a unique opportunity to work with tribes. We often have mutual goals. If it's a state agency or a university, we're trying to work towards some of the same things. So I think helping you understand a little bit of federal Indian policy and law will really be beneficial. So as you can see, in the Northwest region, we have lots of tribes. We have 29 tribes here in the state of Washington. I do a lot of work with affiliated tribes and Northwest Indians, and that's 57 tribes in the Northwest region. So we're going to talk about some of the protocols, some of the best way to work with tribal governments. You need to understand that every tribe is unique. It has its own culture and language. Some tribes might have a similar dialect. Let's say Interior Salish might be similar with the Spokane, the Spokane, the Kalispel, and the Salish of Montana. But we have very unique cultural practices, and every tribe has a unique history with their relationship with the United States government. And this will tell you the establishment of the reservation, how we reserve lands to ourselves. Some tribes are executive order tribes, like the Spokane tribe, the Spokane, the Colville tribe, the Coeur d'Alene tribe of Idaho. Other tribes are treaty tribes, maybe a Treaty of Point Elliott, like the Lummi Nation, or some of the other Stevens treaties of 1855, like the Yakima Nation. So you understand a little bit more about a tribe if you pay attention to their organic documents. Is it a treaty tribe? Is it executive order tribe? And then you understand the ceded territory. And I'll explain what that is in just 1 minute. But tribes have authority and consultation authority in their ceded territories. So they have rights to hunt and fish. They have rights to consultation for historic preservation. If you're going to be doing any work or construction in a tribe ceded territory, you often have to work with that tribe for cultural resource protection issues. And so we think about some of these ceded areas. Here you can see this is the Spokane Indian Reservation, the kind of gray shaded reservation. That's the current reservation lands today. The dotted line is the ceded territory of the Spokane tribe. Sometimes we might overlap with other tribes and we might agree to disagree, but understanding where tribes ceded territory are the lands that they ceded to the United States government, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So both executive order tribes and treaty tribes have been very successful in the United States Supreme Court. Just recently, the Coeur d'Alene tribe won a 7-year battle in the Supreme Court, where the United States Supreme Court upheld the Coeur d'Alene tribe's claim to the southern third of the Lake Coeur d'Alene. And the decision acknowledged the ownership of historically and culturally important lake and river of Lake Coeur d'Alene. So the tribe once held a domain of 3.5 million acres. It was whittled down over the years to make way for white settlement. Yet the tribe had always sought to include the lake. It's very important to their cultural way of being, their livelihood, hunting, fishing, recreating on the lake. It was part of their livelihood. And so having ownership of the 1/3 of the lake was really important. And they won that case at the United States Supreme Court. Another case here in Washington is the Yakima Nation Cougar Den. Now, I don't have the opportunity to share with you federal Indian law, which I would love to do. I teach federal Indian law, and we do that over 3 months. But I just wanted to share a couple recent cases. This is the United States Supreme Court Cougar Den, in which the U.S. Supreme Court held a 5-4 decision that the Yakima Nation right to travel. One of the clauses that they had in their treaty from 1855 was their ability to trade and bring their goods to sale. So it prohibited a state gas tax. and what Justice Breyer wrote, to impose a tax burden on travel and the right to travel on public highways is just what the treaty protects. It's exactly what the ancestors of the Yakama Nation negotiated for, the right to bring their trade goods to travel. So this was another Supreme Court win, and I just wanted to mention both treaty tribes and executive order tribes have been successful at the United States Supreme Court. So understanding the tribes that you might want to work with. Every tribe is different. The Colville tribe is 1.4 million acres. The Yakama Nation is 1.2 million acres. And just to give you perspective, for the Yakama Nation, when they entered in their treaty, they ceded 10 million acres and they retained 1.2 million acres. So it is a very expensive bargain that we made with the United States government. So keep that in perspective. Ceded 10 million acres and retained 1 for their own reservation. The Kalispel Reservation is 4,557 acres in Usk, Washington. I'm just showing you that there's quite a difference. In eastern Washington, we have large land-based tribes. Here in western Washington, we sometimes have city, urban area tribes like Puyallup, in the city of Tacoma. There's just quite a bit of difference. If you look at the demographics, if you're talking about the Navajo Nation, there are 400,000 tribal members. If you're talking about the Spokane tribe, there's 2,950. So quite a big difference. Membership requirements, what it requires to be a member of a tribe, it's the last vestige of sovereignty, how tribes define their membership. Many tribes look at a quarter of degree of that tribe's Indian blood. Every tribe can define that. In the Navajo Nation, 1/4 Navajo to be enrolled tribal member. Every tribe has different priorities. When you're talking about what is important to a tribe based on their culture, their community needs, and their history, as well as their resources, every tribe's going to be a little bit different. If you're talking about environmental priorities and it's the Spokane tribe, maybe it's uranium contamination, or we want clean water quality in the Spokane River. We set our water quality standards under the Clean Water Act, and we are reintroducing salmon. If you're talking about the Umatillas or the Yakimas, it may be, in fact, you know, right now our governor is advocating for green energy. And if you're talking, let's say, about wind turbines, that might be great, but that's particularly hard on the Umatillas and the Yakimas if that's their ceded territory where they go out and gather roots, where they dig their traditional foods and medicines. Once the state leases that to a private company, it's a challenge for we don't have access to it to get our traditional medicines and foods. So we all have different priorities. When you think about tribal sovereignty, you must understand a little bit about federal preemption. You cannot do good planning or work with tribes without understanding just a little bit of American Indian history and understanding concepts of tribal sovereignty and federal preemption in this whole field of Indian affairs. State law does not apply to tribes unless the tribe has taken on some kind of state money or a state project. European colonial governments presuppose their right to take the world from its original habitants. They looked at justification in Christian evangelism or Roman law conquest. All of these international laws of conquest, the ideas of treaties, is something we make with foreign nations. So tribes were treated like foreign nations. And again, we don't have the time to talk about federal Indian law, but I wanted to share, just to give you a framework, what are some sources of federal Indian law? Where do all these rules come from? It's a great question. International law and practice, we look to borrowed and settled principles of international law, like I mentioned, Roman law, title of European government, Spanish law of conquest. An important one for tribes is our inherent tribal sovereignty. The tribes have our own right to govern our people. At the time of European discovery, tribes were sovereign by nature and by necessity. We conducted our own affairs and we were not dependent on any outside source of law. So tribes at the very beginning, we have inherent tribal sovereignty. There are treaties. There are 369 treaties entered into between tribes and United States. Federal statutes. Statutes are laws that are enacted by Congress. There are some laws enacted by Congress that specifically apply to tribes, like the Indian Child Welfare Act or the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And then it's a question whether statutes of general applicable, whether they're applicable or not. Next, you have executive order tribes, which is a unilateral agreement entered into the president establishing the reservation. So for example, my reservation, the Spokane Indian Reservation, was established January 18th, 1881 by President Rutherford B. Hayes. The treaties are more of a bilateral agreement between the United States government and a particular tribe. And then lastly, there are federal court decisions that are made in federal courts that apply to tribes. In Indian country, tribes are always wanting to be careful. If we make bad law, that applies to all the other tribes. So now we have sovereignty coalitions. If I want to litigate a case, it's each tribe's sovereign right to do so, but we want to make good case law because it applies to all the other tribes. So tribal attorneys like myself would have talked to tribal attorneys back in DC. And just quickly, other sources of federal Indian law, and we'll make these slides available. I won't go through every single one, but administrative regulations, which are regulatory agencies. A very important one, the U.S. Constitution. It's the U.S. Constitution is where the Indian Commerce Clause provides the treaty clause, the supremacy of federal laws over supreme over state laws, and then tribal law. Each of our own tribes have our own tribal law and order code, where we enact laws that apply to our reservation. So the Spokane tribe has a law and order code. The Lummi Nation has their own law and order code that we administer on our reservations. So again, the United States Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with Indian tribes. The first Congress passed a Trade and Intercourse Act, which put Indian affairs under exclusive federal control, prohibited all but federal agencies from negotiating cessions of Indian land, to the exclusion of the states. Why? Because the founding fathers wanted access to our lands, to the exclusion of the states. So it's Indian country is under that federal umbrella and is very restricted. So just to understand a little bit about sovereignty and treaty making, it's essentially a contract between two nations. Indian tribes are recognized as sovereign nations, and the European countries, as they began settling North America as early as the 1600s, they entered into treaties to obtain land. After the United States gained more military power and independence from Great Britain, it relied on these treaties to conduct formal relations with tribes. I know that I'm moving pretty quickly. Some of this, many of you may know the basics of federal Indian policy and law, so I'm kind of doing a thumbnail sketch so everybody can get a little something out of our talk today. Tribal inherent sovereignty, again, was recognized and reinforced by Supreme Court decisions from 1823. I don't have time to talk about the Marshall Trilogy, but tribes, the United States recognized tribes as distinct, independent political communities retaining their original natural rights and ranked among those powers capable of making treaties. So we look at the legal and political relationship between tribes and federal government, and it's been augmented. It's become greater by Congress, the executive branch, the courts, with statutes, with court decisions, with treaties. All of this has created federal Indian law. If you look at tribal legal status, not every tribe signed a treaty. Some tribes have executive orders that, as I mentioned, but the same principles can be drawn if you're analyzing treaties or executive orders. You begin to understand the nature of tribal legal status. Again, treaties dealt with the acquisitions of land. We think about what the treaties meant. What did they say? It was to obtain cessions of land from tribal people. They wanted it through negotiation versus warfare, basically. The United States typically gave the tribe a set of promises, and the treaties varied from one tribe to another. There are 8 Stevens treaties here in Washington, but nearly all of them recognized sovereignty of tribes and contained express assurances that the federal government would protect tribes. So we talk about this trust responsibility and what are the rights secured by treaty. So there were important rights that were guaranteed, rights to treaty tribes for ownership of beneficial ownership of Indian lands, hunting, fishing, entitlement to certain federal services such as education and health care, although there's been limitations to those, how it, many of us still all pay for our own education, and our tribes pay for our education. So some of the treaties, the promises of treaties, have not been upheld by the federal government like they should be. Many of these present rights are now a product of statute and executive agreement. So you can see this is an example of the Yakima Reservation, large land-based tribe in eastern Washington, lots of highways, lots of towns. I'll give a number of examples of different tribes. I've done a lot of work at the Yakima Nation. We've had youth public service announcements. We did traffic fatality videos, lots of work in the different tribes. So basically, just for federal Indian law, when you think of canons of construction, how do you understand case law? Ambiguities in treaties or case law are to be resolved in favor of the tribal people. Why? Because they were negotiated in a different language, in English. They were sometimes negotiated under duress. If you look at some of the Salish tribes in the Bitterroot Salish community, they woke up with guns pointed at them as they came outside of their lodges and homes. So treaties must be interpreted for the benefit of, in the benefit or the eyes of the tribal people, how Indians would have understood them, and must be liberally construed in favor of tribal people. Of course, that doesn't always happen, and it depends on who's at the Supreme Court. A number of years ago, it's probably been, almost 20 years ago, we had Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and Justice Stephen Breyer out to our reservation so that they could see that we're real normal communities with court systems functioning as a matter of law. So it's important for us to understand that there is a federal trust relationship, how the federal government deals with Indian tribes and tribal governments. This trust relationship requires the United States government to look out for the best interest of tribal people and not harm or injure our tribal rights. And these are often known as canons of construction and are very important to tribal people to get favorable court decisions. But again, not everybody understands these canons of construction. 4 basic themes of federal Indian policy and law. Tribes are independent entities with inherent powers of self-government. The independence of tribes are subject to the powers of Congress to regulate and modify the status of tribes. So Congress does have that plenary authority over tribal governments. The power to deal with and regulate tribal activities is wholly federal. States are excluded unless Congress delegates the power to them, like, let's say, negotiating compacts under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. The federal government has a responsibility for the protection of Indian tribes and their properties, including protection from encroachment by states and their citizens. Tribal sovereignty, again, this is the ability of tribes to make laws and be governed by them. From the very beginning of American history, our inherent sovereignty has been recognized. Our ancestors had the power to govern their people before Europeans arrived. I'm going to move into some discussion about some maps, but I just want to say that there are three broad areas of trust duties. Congress has placed a major trust responsibility in the Department of Interior. It has delegated certain authorities to these government agencies, like Bureau of Indian Affairs. This official relationship is between the United States Congress and tribal governments. Duties are protection of Indian trust property. So if a company comes in and is trying to pollute or contaminate land, it's the federal government's trust responsibility to help regulate and protect that land. That's why on our particular reservation, we had mining companies come in, create entire uranium contaminated sites, and it's now a Superfund site. So the trust responsibility is also the protection of Indian rights and self-government, and then provision of those social, medical, and educational services that are necessary for the survival of tribes. So I want to just talk a little bit today about how our tribal governments function. Many of you may be out doing work with tribes, either doing transportation projects or research projects. I want to ask you to be sure, before you go out and work with a tribe, understand a little bit about their history. They have organic documents. They have a tribal constitution or bylaws. They have a general membership, all the voting members over 18, the tribal council, executive director. We're going to talk a little bit about those organizational structures, their department, and their tribal programs. Before you go out to work for a tribe, please understand a little bit about their history, about their reserved lands, about their ceded territories, and before you ever ask them for something, please provide them with something. When people come to my committee at ATNI, Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, and they say, Margot, we'd like to have a listening session, or Margot, we'd like to work with the tribal leaders on this, I said, well, what are you going to bring them? What, are you going to help them solve a problem that they're having? Are you going to provide some technical assistance? We've worked with tribes and provided crash data reports or finding solutions on solving some of their planning problems. So bring them something in trade. Don't just ask the tribe, hey, we want to do this research and get this paper published. Offer the tribe something with sincere interest in helping them solve their problems. Tribal governments, I think this is our Nez our Nimipu brothers and sisters, or brothers in this picture. We have lots of tribal council females. They make laws for governing the conduct of persons in Indian country. They establish bodies, tribal police, tribal courts. They administer justice on their reservation. They can exclude non-Indians from the reservation. We don't have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians, which makes it a real challenge if there's drug dealers or human trafficking. And the very issue that was that case was the Oliphant case, which said we couldn't regulate the illegal conduct of a drunk driver. And this makes me crazy. And even my students are like, Professor Hill, if we go into Idaho, we're subject to the laws of the state of Idaho. Yes, it is very unfair. And it makes it hard for tribes to regulate bad actors and bad behavior. But that's where we are currently. And tribal councils also regulate hunting and fishing, land use, environmental practices. So this is an example of, this is the Lummi Nation. Their organizational chart. You may have an executive director or a general manager that oversee the tribal departments and programs, but they've got IT and human resources and education and natural resources, a planning and public works department, family services, behavioral health, healthcare and administration, a whole range of different programs. And I'll give you examples of other tribal organizational charts as well. The powers to control Indian affairs is shared between the federal government and Indian nations to the exclusion of the states. Many of these diverse, complicated elements, it may impinge on the design or implementation of tribal planning and land use. I'm going to talk specifically about land use and discuss some of the struggles that we have in Indian country. But first, I want to talk to you about tribal protocols. How do you work with tribes? You should understand how a tribe is organized and how it works. And again, every tribe is different. What is the structure of the tribal council? What is the structure of their departments? At the Colville tribe, you might have 14 different tribal council persons. At the Spokane tribe, you might have 5. So there's a different number. What is the structure of their departments? How do they do their business? Many tribes have a corporate arm in which they do business to keep the politics out of the operation, the business operation. So they'll have a corporate board or economic development of the economic development arm of the tribe. It still has that tribal sovereign immunity, that sovereign shield, if folks are working within the scope of their employment. That tribal enterprise is still most likely shielded in that tribal sovereign immunity. How do they have their meetings organized? What's their resolution process? If you are working with a staff member, you want to ask that staff member, how is it best to work with tribal council to get a project approved? You will coordinate with tribal council staff. Don't make the tribal council secretaries mad. They can make it real hard on you. The tribal council is organized sometimes in committees. Each tribal council is assigned different areas. You'll have some tribal council that might take the lead on law and justice, some that have more knowledge and experience with natural resources, some may be into community development, fisheries, health and human services, management and budget, and so on. This is how the Colville tribe organizes their tribal council issues. And then they meet on different days of the week, and then they will have a day where all of the tribal council meet together. And their committee chart is online, but again, we will be making these slides available. If you want to do a project with the tribal council, understand how they do business. For the Colville tribe, they'll have an agenda application that you in your program that you're working with, if it's the planning department or if it's the health and human services department, you'll fill out an agenda application. And there's going to be questions. Is this topic for discussion only by tribal council? Or is there going to be a PowerPoint? Or are you trying to get some kind of decision or resolution? Do we need an administrative review? Are you going to need the chairman's signature? Is there going to be a vote? There's a very, very formal process. And pay attention to the deadlines. Again, tribal governments are very sophisticated, very busy individuals. If you want to work with a tribe, pay attention to their deadlines if you want to get anything done. Tribal corporations. I just wanted to take a second and talk a little bit about tribal corporations. A tribally owned business is very different from a business owned by a tribal member. There are specific forms of tribal business structures that tribes can take advantage of when establishing their business under tribal, federal, or state law. When a tribe incorporates, it will need to determine which structure that they want to set up the tribally owned business, how they want to adopt their policies and procedures, and under whose law will it be organized. A tribally owned business can be formed as an Indian reorganization, an IRA, Section 17 corporation, a tribally chartered corporation, or a state chartered tribal corporation. Each structure has different consequences in terms of tax liability, preservation of tribal assets, and corporate transparency requirements for potential creditors, auditors, so forth, investors, partners, regulators, and customers. So there's different ways that you can set up the business arm of your corporation. This is an organizational chart from the Jamestown Sklallam. just to give you an idea, so our tribal citizens are at the top of our organizational chart. We have a tribal constitution. We have a tribal council that's supposed to be separate from our tribal court system that checks and balances. Then you have a chief executive officer, maybe executive director. You have a COO. You might have, you can see the Jamestown Slalom Gaming Incorporated or Economic Development Authority. Often the tribal council will delegate their authority. They will appoint people to boards, commissions, the corporate board. I served on our tribe's enterprise board for many years at the Spokane Tribe. I've also spent 10 years at the Colville Tribal Gaming Commission. That's a delegation of tribal authority to a board to make decisions and regulate the casino operations or to regulate a particular authority. So that's kind of, you can see how the boards are formed, and then you have your different departments and programs that are under the executive director. Here in Washington State, we are fortunate that we have a nice system set up called the Washington State Centennial Accord. Years ago, we had some amazing tribal leaders, Joe Dela Cruz of the Quinault Nation, Ron Allen of the Jamestown Slalom, and Mel Tenasket from the Colville Tribe that said, wouldn't it be nice if when we had to work with the state, they would do this and that we could understand this. And so they wrote down those concepts and met with the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs. Now we have the Centennial Accord. Many of our goals are common with the state. We want our citizens to be healthy and be provided adequate services with nice transportation and highways, so we need to work together. The Centennial Accord makes up a system in which state agencies check in with tribal leaders along with the governor. And any problems that we're having with any particular state agencies, tribal leaders can bring it to the attention and get resolutions. So when you're going to work with a tribe, think about their planning documents, the tribal constitution, the law and order code. We have planning documents, much like general comprehensive plans that everybody else is familiar with. The Lummi Nation has a community plan. The Colville Tribe, as well as the Spokane Tribe, have integrated resource management plans. This is how they manage their natural resources and their lands. The Spokane Tribal Community has a community sustainable master plan. This is how we make decisions for our communities going forward. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the jurisdictional problems, but again, we don't have time to do all of that. In fact, I think we're getting close to, I do have to catch a flight, so I'll be booking out of here pretty quickly at the end of our talk. But I wanted to explain to you a little bit about the jurisdictional issues. The checkerboard land pattern and land tenure makes it real hard when we don't have criminal jurisdiction over people that are committing crimes, like dealing drugs and violent crimes. We are dependent upon the US government, and that's the FBI, to investigate those crimes, and the US attorneys to prosecute. Just last week, I was at Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, and I was told that how many FBI agents were in our region? 2 of all the tribes in our region. I'm like, oh my gosh. And they're supposed to investigate the major crimes. That's murder, rape, arson. That's insane. But that's what happens when you have laws that are limited, that limits the jurisdiction. We do have some laws that we've been working on to enhance tribal jurisdiction, but that's for a discussion for another day. But just understand criminal law, domestic violence, no jurisdiction over non-Indians makes it really challenging. Civil law, there's some challenges with the Montana test and how some of the laws have come down. Environmental problems, having jurisdiction over non-Indians who are polluting your reservation is essential. So we do have jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. Tribes can apply for treatment as a state and set water quality standards so that we can regulate people who might be trying to dump oil or pollutants into our land base. And then of course zoning issues. So if you just take a quick snapshot of federal Indian policy, it's this pendulum that swings back and forth. First, the United States government says, we're going to take your lands and you're going to be removed to these remote areas that nobody else wants. And we're going to have treaties and set up reservations. And then in 1887, they had the General Allotment Act, which broke up those lands that we held communally and allotted each individual tribal member lands. And then they said, oh, wait, no. We're going to have the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, and we're going to respect tribal governments, and you guys can organize to manage your own affairs. And then back again, we see the 1950s, where you have termination. We're going to terminate, now that we have your land, we're going to terminate our trust responsibility. And we're going to assimilate you and make you into the American melting pot as quickly as we can. So they had relocation processes. And then in 1975, it swings back to Indian Self-Determination Act. But these federal processes, one of our graduate students in our urban planning program at EW, Zach Becker, created this map. You can see where the United States government moved tribal people from their traditional territories into major urban cities. If you're talking about in Minneapolis, Minnesota, they were moved down into California. Same with the Spokanes and the Colvilles. Colville Tribal Friends relocated into San Francisco or San Jose. My mother was actually born here in Seattle. My grandparents were relocated for the war effort because all of our tribal citizens worked on, to support the war efforts. So my mom was born here in Seattle in 1942. But you look at how indigenous people were moved from Alaska to Seattle, from Alaska to Chicago. And we have lots of urban Indian communities because of these forced relocation processes. Again, tribal reservations are very complicated land tenure. We have highways, major highways going through, connecting. We have transit programs that we work with rural transit partners. With this map, you can really see the land tenure. So the Umatillas, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Oregon has, you can see their originally 1855 treaty. And this is a typical story. We signed this treaty, and then the United States government takes half of it back. Why? Because white settlers moved into this territory. We're like, oh, they can't give that to those Indians. And it happened on the Colville Res, on the Spokane Res, on the Yakima Res, over and over again, where you have large swaths of land taken away after a contract was signed. Pure injustice. But you can see the different land tenure. So you have tribal trust property, which is in the dark blue purple, the gold property, which is fee, and the cream color, which is non-Indian. So this is the checkerboard pattern that causes real difficulty for tribes to do any kind of economic development or to have transportation projects when we have to deal with these different types of land tenure. So to understand it, our reservations have these layers of law, right? You have federal laws. If it's a major crime, murder, rape, arson, then the U.S. Attorney's Office, they come in and you have federal laws. If it's a state, if you have a non-Indian on a fee parcel of property within the reservation, maybe there's some state laws that apply. And then, of course, tribal citizens on trust property, you have trust property. But you have these layers of laws, which makes it very complicated, but you can understand if you understand a little bit about the land tenure. So tribes are doing amazing things. We're developing health centers. Here at the University of Washington, we have the beautiful intellectual house, a place for us to meet and our students to work when they come to the University of Washington. We are creating nursing programs. If you want tribal support, you can go to individual tribes or come to Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. We have a resolutions process where you ask the chair to present. Maybe it's health or transportation or natural resources. There's be discussions by tribal leaders. The committee may pass a resolution or make some changes Recently, I think the University of Washington is looking to fund its phase 2 of this facility, as well as a Native American Health Sciences. That resolution can move from affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. Again, AT&I is 57 tribes in the Northwest. We are a powerhouse in the Northwest. Often, our president at AT&I will go on to be the president of the National Congress of American Indians. Recently, Fawn Sharp from the Quinault Nation. We've had Joe Dela Cruz. We've had Mel Tenasket. Many leaders from the Northwest have gone on to lead the National Congress of American Indians. I'm going to begin to wrap up and just tell you tribes are doing amazing things. We are protecting water quality like nobody else. We are fighting for clean, fast running water. We're checking the turbidity and temperature because we're reintroducing salmon. Even up above Chief Joe or on the Spokane River, where we once had 80-pound salmon that you could hang from the saddle of a horse and it almost touched the ground. Beautiful. And we're restoring habitat. The Coeur d'Alene tribe bought land and put it into trust and is conserving it as wildlife habitat. So we're doing amazing things in Indian country. We have powerful tribal members that are scientists and attorneys. Autumn worked to fight opioid pharmaceutical companies. This is Autumn Dawn, and Jeanette Finley from the Colville tribe is a scientist working for her reservation. We have indigenous women in Congress that are elected to Congress. Deborah Holland is a Laguna Pueblo from New Mexico, and then Sharice Davis from the Ho-Chunk Nation from Kansas. And of course, Deborah Holland is now the Secretary of Interior, really setting the agenda, protecting parklands. And then we have young people. Much of the work we do is for future generations and to look out for our future generations. And I think we have time for a few questions. If anybody has any questions? And we have a microphone if somebody.
Hey, Margot, thank you very much. I have a question about doing business with the tribal community for education-related things. So I wonder if we do, for example, the educational collaboration with Yakama Nation, for example, do we need to apply for a license, or you just apply through the procedure you showed, and if we get approval, we can do it?
That's a great question. So typically, and here's the mic for the next question. If somebody wants to come grab this mic. It's this mic. Oh, it's that mic? Okay. So you would work with the tribe's education department, and you would talk to the education department. They're the experts. They know what their tribal communities need. And if you want to partner with them, then just, work with the education department, ask what their needs are, and then tell them what you might be able to do for them. We can help you create a summer camp. We can help, teach a class on applying for scholarships. We can give you resources and work with you to get your students to campus. So work with that program director, and then they can bring it to council or invite you to come and present to the council, and you can show them these are studies that show how people learn best in engineering. We would like to set up an engineering program to bring tribal members to the university. They would love that. Just talk to the program director, and they'll guide you on how to best do that process.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your time. I have a question that's kind of specific. I'm currently researching about the Lower Elwha tribe and the graving dock construction incident, basically the uncovering of Chiweetzin. And so it's, as I understand it, using the language, land in trust, where ancient burials were found in the construction process of a WSDOT, so a Department of Transportation project. And I'm curious if you're familiar with the case and I'm curious about the current status of kind of this engagement with tribes between construction firms when, for example, artifacts are uncovered on these lands that are in trust. So what would your recommendation be as best practices to engage with tribes in these particular instances when, it's a construction firm, so not necessarily following that sovereignty of government to government. Just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Okay, so that's a great question, and so we have cultural resource protection sites in Eastern Washington. Just to give you an example, context, with hydropower, they use our reservation lands as flood control, right? They draw it all the way down, and then they just raise it all the way back. It's to protect all these rich, fancy homes along the river or the lake or whatever it is, but it's basically flood control. For my particular tribe, we buried our ancestors along the river. So it's very harmful when you're drawing down and lifting up and you're drawing down. It exposes our ancestral remains. So what you're talking about is also a cultural resource protection issue, right? Some tribes put their resource protection studies right on their website. The Colville tribe has a cultural resource protection study right on their website. And they talk about sacred sites and how you can best work with their tribe. So most all tribes will have a THPO. We have historic preservation officers in the state. Many times the tribe will have a tribal historic preservation officer. So you contact that person. If there's ancestral remains, then you definitely want to talk to the culture department, because that's a reburial ceremony. There's specific protocol when it's our ancestral remains, and we go out and we collect the remains, have ceremony. And many universities are dealing with this right now. If you have human remains in your collection, you need to work with the tribes to identify which tribe those remains might belong to and return them, right? For a private firm, you would definitely, state laws will apply and it can stop your construction. So you want to work with that tribe and know that they have a tribal historic preservation officer, and then they have a culture department that will work with you on the proper procedure.
Can I just a quick follow-up?
Sure. So ARPA, there's resource protection laws that we have a right to protect our cultural and our ancestral remains. So there's different laws. The state requires for any project state dollars, federal dollars, but repatriation, American Indian repatriation, will require you to return those items to a particular tribe. It can be litigation like the Kennewick man, but particularly when it comes to human remains, we're very sensitive, and every tribe has a different protocol.
Okay, thanks, Margot. We have a question that came in online.
Okay.
Is there a central agency or organization in Washington / the the Pacific Northwest where someone could go to pitch some collaboration ideas where they could reach all 29 Washington tribes or all 59 tribes in the region at one time?
So it depends. It depends on the subject, but that's just an attorney joke, right? But the Washington State Office of Governor's Indian Affairs has a list of tribes and tribal organizations. So you can go to the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs, and they have a whole list of tribes. Again, there's different organizations based on subject matter. If you're talking about gaming, it's the Washington, WIGA. There's an association of gaming tribes. If you're talking about natural resources, there'll be different associations, and we're pretty sophisticated. We will have organizations based on watersheds, right? Upper Columbia United Tribes versus Critfic, right? The other tribes, depending on their location within the water basin. So it depends. Affiliated Tribes and Northwest Indians is, again, the leadership of 57 tribes in Oregon, Washington, Idaho. So it just depends on your particular subject matter, how we might be organized. But again, the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs has a list of tribes and tribal contacts.
Were there a lot of tribes involved with Inslee's decision on some of the dam removals along the Snake or the Columbia?
Well, we kind of all get pulled into it. Of course, hydropower is very hard on tribes, right? For my tribe, it cut off all of our salmon. Our salmon was our lifeway. Our tribe, the Swinquamena, is the salmon, the pink cheek people. And now we don't have salmon above Chief Joe. So it depends. We understand, how hydropower works and that it lights our homes and it runs agriculture and irrigation, all those kind of things. And so, so many of the tribes don't say, oh, just tear down all those dams. There are some dams maybe on the Snake River that aren't as necessary, but people freak out when you say dam removal. Although, we have to do everything we can to protect the salmon. I always think about the orca whale. We watched the mama push her baby for how many days? 17 days, I think it was. And how sad would our world be if we didn't have orca whales? So there's a lot of things that we need to partner together, whether it's BPA or Avista, the different hydropower managers and operators, to get fish, having thriving habitats and protecting water quality. One of the things that all of us are responsible for is tire dust. That's really a toxic soup on our water systems. But tribes are working really hard. We litigated the culvert case to make sure that there were salmon streams. And that's good for everybody when we protect the salmon or we fight for water quality standards under the Clean Water Act, because many of our rivers they're connected to our aquifers. I know in Spokane, our Spokane River is connected to our aquifer, and my students always hear about it, that if you want clean water, then you better advocate for water quality standards.
And on that subject, the water quality, Hanford is a big, deep subject, but is that out in the Yakima Nation?
Yeah,
so how did the tribe get involved with the cleanup, or just involvement with the government on the cleanup?
There's lots of, under federal acts like the Clean Water Act, we can apply for treatment as a state and then set water quality standards. Again, people get real crabby with tribes when they set high water quality standards, but clean water is good for everybody. So tribes have very sophisticated, we have scientists and hydrologists, and we litigate these issues for water adjudication to leave some clean water in the river for our salmon. And then also, there's lots of pollutants that go right into our waterways. So working with our local communities, whether it's storage tanks to get the water cleaned and purified, or just stopping the runoff and to having some vegetation. There's lots of tribes that are working with the Conservation Northwest and the Lands Council to have vegetation to protect some of those water bodies.
So we're very close to the scheduled time, but I want to take the opportunity to ask the last question. Okay. This is certainly very helpful for us to learn how to do business with tribes. My question is, are you aware of a website or any place as a single shop we can go to find everything relevant to what we need to know before we do business with the tribes.
Okay. NARF, the Native American Rights Fund, is an Indian law resource that keeps a lot of the tribal law and order codes as well as their constitution and bylaws. So there's some national Indian law resources. I love Turtle Talk. They provide a lot of information and recent case law and interpretations and access to Indian law. So you can sign up for some of those organizations. But each tribe, to varying degrees, will have their codes and constitutions on their website. Sometimes they still don't trust outsiders, and you don't blame them. And so they might not have all their stuff on their website, but there are very progressive tribes, Tulalip or Puyallup, that have money that put all of their zoning codes on their website.
That's great. Thank you very much, Margot. So maybe you do not know, Margot flew actually a long distance from Spokane through California coming to here, just try to make today's webinar, seminar talk. And she also needs to fly back immediately after this. So let's give her a big round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you very much for joining today's seminar. I'm Yin Tai Wang. I'm a professor at the University of Washington. I'm also the director of the Northwestern Tribal Technical Assistance Program Center. We will work together. If you want to help us, let us know. We certainly need a lot of help understanding better how we could help the tribal community. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. It's wonderful.